Hi everyone, I'm Gwen from Nile. Nile is a serverless Postgres for building modern SaaS. And as you probably know, the most important thing about SaaS is your customers. We usually call these customers tenants. So in this video, I want to talk and go really in depth into what are these tenants, why you need tenant management capabilities, and what tenant management capabilities Nile provides you. So let's get started. First of all, what are tenants? As I just said, tenants are your customers. So we're talking about companies, organizations, things like workspaces in Slack or projects in Jira and Linear. And usually these entities called tenants, they represent a group of users working on something related to your application together. SaaS applications are normally multi-tenant, so you'll have one application serving many of those tenants. Although some people deploy a different application stack per tenant. It depends on how you built your project. But the key thing is that tenants are this basic building block for SaaS. So every feature that you're building really has to take tenants into consideration, and even operational things like upgrading, backupping, restoring. You always have to think, how will it affect my customers? Meaning, how will it interact with tenants? Now, Nile has built-in tenant virtualization, and this makes it easy and reliable, safe, cost-effective, and pretty darn fast way to develop and then also support different SaaS use cases across the globe. In order to go in depth into what tenant management capabilities Nile provides, let me log into Nile and show you some things. So I have an existing database here, but let me create a new one. And we'll call it Ambitious Flower. Okay, so we have the database here. It's in status green, so let's get in. And you can see that even though I just created a brand new database, it already has a table called tenant. And the idea is that because tenant is such a basic building block for building SaaS, we figured, yes, of course you're going to need a table in which to manage a list of your customers. So we provided one built in. If we view the table, we can see that each tenant will have a unique identifier. It will have a name, and then there are a few more columns that are used for bookkeeping. How do I create a tenant or a customer in Nile? Very straightforward. We do an insert. The SDK has a create tenant and the API has create tenant, but we're here in using SQL, so we're just doing insert into. And if we look at the table again, we can see our first tenant over here. And you can see that the ID was auto-generated, and you can see it's a UUID. So it's random and it's very secure. This is an important thing. You're going to use this ID to refer to your customer. You don't really want any third party to know how many customers you have. If someone signs up and gets, I'm customer number 5, they kind of know you're a new business. So this allows you to keep privacy. Now, in the future, you're going to be able to do a few more cool things here. For example, specify a location. If you have some tenants in the US and some in Europe, you can say, hey, these are customers are in US, these are in Europe. And Nile knows how to place the data correctly. So both customers will have great low latency experience. And also, if there are different regulations into different locations, Nile is aware of those. So it will take care of a lot of things for you behind the scenes. But this is for later. Now, once you have a tenant, one of the things you want to do is store data for this tenant. And you do it by means of creating tenant-aware tables. Tenant-aware tables are basically tables with a tenant ID column. In this way, every row in the table belongs to exactly one tenant, the one specified in the tenant ID column. And this is what Nile uses to virtualize the tenant databases. Nile uses the fact that each column belongs to a different tenant to provide things like isolation and scalability. So let's create a tenant-aware table. For example, imagine that we're building an employee management system. Obviously, you're going to need an employee table. And because each one of your customers is going to have different employees in their company, at least most of the time, you need each employee to belong to exactly one tenant. So it's a great fit for tenant-aware tables. Okay, and you can see that we now have an employee table. Let's take a look at it. Okay, so right now the table is empty because we didn't add any data yet. So let's create a few employees for the first tenant, right? So my first customer. Okay, so I'm inserting several employees. Note that I have to edit the tenant ID. I just picked example data, but you have to replace it with your actual tenant. Otherwise, obviously, you will not be able to insert data for a tenant that does not exist, because Nile will not know how to virtualize this data into a tenant database. Okay, so we successfully inserted 3 rows here, and again, we can take a look. Here we are with those 3 employees. Now, let's try again and create a second customer. So remember, we create customers by inserting them into the tenants table, successfully inserted. And now we need to fill those blanks with the ID of the second customer. So I'm going to grab it from here. Okay, so we successfully inserted. Let's take a look at our results. And you can see now that we have 3 employees for the first customer, all in the US. And we also have 3 employees for the second customer, all in the UK. Now, usually, in addition to inserting data for a tenant, you will also want to query the tenant. Because Nile provides tenant virtualization, it allows you to set the context and basically connect to a virtual DB that only includes data for a specific tenant, meaning that when we do another query, it will only show us data for that tenant. So let me show you how we connect to customer 1 virtual database. And then when I do select star from employees, I will only see the employees from the US. So Nile enforces this privacy and isolation. So the way we do it is by doing set tenant ID, and I said I'm going to do customer 1. And then I want to do select star from. And as I promised, you now see only users that belong to customer 1. And if you do this in your application and you're careful to always set the correct context, then you basically always get a connection to the right virtual database, which only has data for that tenant, and you will never have to worry about having to juggle access rules and making mistakes and accidentally leaking the data from one customer to another, which is kind of a disaster for SaaS. So let's go back to the tenants table for a second and take a look here. One of the things that you notice is that we have a bunch of columns built in, but you may have additional data per tenant that you will want to store there. So for example, you may have contact details for this tenant. You want to know who to call if there's any issues. You also may want to have things like a Stripe customer ID or a Stripe subscription ID, a tier for a customer. All this is good information to store in this table. And in order to store this information, you're going to need additional rows. So one way to do it is basically to create another table with tenant ID and then all the additional rows like tenant extra information. But even cooler, you can add columns to this tenant table. So let's say I want to add some contact details. That's that the alter command was successful. So let's take a look. And you can see over here that the phone number and address columns were added to the tenants table. I can now store contact information for any tenant in my database. Let's continue with the employee management system example. If I'm managing employees, very common, I want to know which benefits each employee has. Does he have health insurance, life insurance? We want to track which benefits each employee is using. Let's create a benefits table, and let's take a look specifically at how it relates to the tables we already have. So you have over here, you can see that you have the usual columns that you would expect from a benefits table. But let's take a look at the foreign keys. First of all, we have a foreign keys to the tenants table. We're making sure that every tenant ID references an actual tenant in the tenants table. Now, be aware that Nile will enforce this relationship whether you want to or not. You will not be able to insert data of a non-existing tenant because we need to make sure that we have the ability to virtualize this table into the different tenant databases. But you may, if you want to create it, it works. In addition, we have a foreign key to the employees table. So we reference the employee ID because benefits belong to specific employees. We want to have this relationship. Note that because this is a tenant-aware table and we're creating a foreign key to another tenant-aware table, you need to have the tenant ID as part of the relation. Why is that? Mostly for safety, to make sure that you are not accidentally connecting the benefit to the wrong employee. And last but not least, you can see the primary key constraint. When and if you're creating a primary key on your tenant-aware tables, make sure that you include the tenant ID in the primary key, because again, if you think about it, we're going to virtualize the table. It's going to have a part of it in each virtual tenant database. We need to enforce primary key constraint, meaning uniqueness and non-null in each database separately, which means that tenant ID has to be part of this constraint. Because foreign key, when it references a primary key, has to reference all columns in the primary key. This also means that if anything ever references the benefits table, it will also include the tenant ID in the foreign key reference. So this is why you'll always see tenant ID in primary keys, tenant ID in foreign keys. One of the things you often want to do when you have multiple tables and you want to start populating them and do actions on those employees is that, let's say a new employee joins the company. You need to insert him in the correct employee ID, employees table, and you also need to create his benefits to track them in the benefits table. If we fail to enter him in the benefits table, we may want to roll the whole thing back and try again rather than stay in with partial data. I'm talking about transactional atomicity, and it's important. So, of course, Nile supports transactions for activities that are done within a single tenant. Okay, so here's an example. We're beginning the transaction. We're inserting data into the employees table. We have a new employee. And then we're also giving him some benefits. Let's pick a tenant for this. Let's put him in the first customer. Okay, and we run the transaction. You can see that this successfully inserted 2 rows. And if we go and view benefits, we can see plan A. If we go to employees, we can see Adam. So this all worked well. Let's say that our customer 1 did not work out very well. He wants to leave the relationship with us. There are several ways you can go about doing this kind of thing, and it really depends on the schema you created. So you can create schema with foreign keys that cascade, and then if you delete a tenant, all the data will be deleted. Or you can allow for deleting the tenant from tenants table, but still keeping all their data. And I can even see cases where you'll delete a customer and then keep all their data for 30 days and then clean it up with another process as required by some laws. So let's try to delete a tenant. First of all, we need to know which one we're deleting. So an interesting thing that happened is that I accidentally created two customer two. Now one of them has data and I may not be able to delete it, but the other one I should be able to delete. So let's try that. Okay, so we're trying to delete an accidental customer two, and it's successfully deleted. So you can see that I have two customer two, they both have data. The extra one that I created by accident is now completely gone. Note that if I try to delete a customer that has data, I'm not going to be able to do it because I have dependencies. I have a bunch of tables with data that references them, and I did not create any cascading, and the default behavior of foreign keys in Postgres is that you will not be able to delete data that has dependencies. You can see that it violates the foreign key constraint on table employees because employees has data that belongs to this customer. So this is an expected error as designed by Postgres. That's it for today. You learned quite a bit here. We went deep into the idea of tenants. We gave some example of what are tenants in SaaS products. We looked into Nile's built-in tenant table. We showed you how to extend it with additional information. And we showed you how to create tenant-aware table that contain data that is specific to one tenant, and you can connect to the tenant virtual database and then see only data that belongs to that tenant. We've also shown how some Postgres features like foreign keys and primary keys behave with tenant IDs and tenant-aware tables. So I hope you found it useful. I recommend as a next step, sign up to Nile, try it yourself. I especially recommend really trying to build a small SaaS application so you can feel how the tenant isolation helps you write cleaner code. If you have any questions, you want to show off your new SaaS application, you want to chat with us, we are always available on the Nile Discord. So come on, join us and let's talk about SaaS and about tenants.